To wrap up our overview of the history of typography, we're going to look at a movement here called Futurism. And this was an art and design movement that burst on the scene in Italy in 1909, and it stayed around until after World War II in the mid 1940s. And the idea about Futurism was a complete throwing away of everything that had gone before and moving forward, looking to the future. It was all about technology and speed and modern approaches, and everything else was just to be dismissed. So this type collage example is a visual depiction of the mindset of Futurism, and modern type designers have definitely looked back to this look and this mindset in modern type design, and this actually has a real way ahead of its time look. And it's not about the readability, it's not about what it is saying, but it's about how it looks. And it's a really fun, very active design style. Related to it is another style called Dada, which was popular around the same time, 1917, 1918. And Dada is similar in many ways, but Dada also relies upon the idea of randomness and chance in creating design. And you can see the kind of haphazard treatment of the word Dada in the background there, creating, again, a very visual, emotional, expressive nature of the use of type that in a lot of ways is still used today in different applications. And so this is way ahead of its time. It's about 100 years old now, and it still has some freshness and liveliness to it. Here's an example of a design style called Constructivism, and this is well worth a look-see and research because it was a design style that started to develop shortly after or close to the end of World War I in Germany and Russia. It's very bold, it's very stark. The balance of this particular piece is very nicely done. It has real discernible focal points, a lot of good balance design-wise, and a good organization of the letter forms with the image. There are a lot of wonderful examples of Russian constructivism online for you to explore. Here's an example of a beautiful piece done at the Bauhaus, which was a school founded in Germany in the early 1920s and later came on over to the United States. But the Bauhaus was not only graphic designers, but furniture designers, industrial designers. It was a real coalition of graphics and visual artist professionals who came together and formed a school where typography and design of all sorts was really beautifully developed. And this piece was created in 1923, but it has a real timeless feel to it and is a beautiful example of alignment and use of typography with abstract visuals. You are probably familiar with the style of Art Deco. This has become synonymous with the late 1920s and the 1930s between the world wars, and it has some elements of Art Nouveau with the organic forms, but the typography was very simple, very elegant, stylized, usually either a sans serif font or a really thick and thin kind of a Broadway style font that really is a hallmark of the style. And to me, it's always exemplified an urban sophistication and a sleekness, which is really very beautiful. Here's an example of something that became popular in the late 1920s. It's called an information graphic, and we see infographics all the time now. It's a whole study of graphic design, as you may know, and it's the visual depiction of information. And how does typography relate to this? Well, the idea of using typography in an information graphic is to keep things very simple. You don't need to have a lot of fancy visual typography because the imagery used in infographics is what is needed to tell the story. But here we have an example of type and imagery working together to tell the story and disseminate information, in this case about casualties and injuries during World War I. Here's another example of Art Deco, and it's that font I was talking about earlier, the Broadway style typeface, where you have extreme thick and thin areas in a letter form, and it's a real hallmark of that particular style. This was a 1933 piece, and it's very forward thinking, very modern, and yet to us, of course, it looks retro. But that's what I like about it. It has that beautiful sort of modern yet retro vintage feel, which is such a classic hallmark of the 30s decade. And typeface design, this is around the same time. Typeface design is really starting to get more streamlined and modern, and you can see the sans serif really taking off here. And this was a very simple font called, it's a version of a font called Universal, and they're mixing capital letters in with the lowercase. You'll notice that the O is completely round and the T is a capital letter. The S, you can't tell if it's uppercase or lowercase. So we're starting to get a little bit more stylized in our typeface design now. And here's a great example of something called the International Typeface Style, typographic style. This is a German poster where it has a really wonderful use of stylized letter forms. Notice that the umlaut over the U is two squares, and the spacing between them is very cleanly designed, and it's very uniform, and there's also a wonderful use of white space and balance with the type at the top. And this is 1928, so but yet it looks very contemporary. So in the 20s and the 30s, typeface design, typography, and graphic design in general really started to move forward and develop some wonderful simplicity and sophistication. Jumping ahead now to the 50s and 60s, this is after World War II, we start to get, in the 50s, people were home from the war, they were building their families, home and family, and a real optimism was pervading the United States. And so we get these whimsical type treatments, we get these colorful ads, we get a real upbeat look. And the type treatment here looks almost handwritten, even though it's not. And it's somewhat casual and friendly and very upbeat. And that was the general pervasive atmosphere in the 1950s. And then the 60s happened. We have a completely different look here, the psychedelic style. And this, of course, is very retro to most of us, but I remember some of this as a child. And here's a sense where the letter forms are completely distorted. They're blown out, and yet they're still readable. It may be really hard to read this, but if you look closely, you can see that up here we see the word Youngbloodz. This was a band popular in the 60s. And there's more lettering inside these very stylized figures. This is kind of hard to read. Down at the bottom we see this blue text which says Avalon Ballroom. That was a popular rock music hall in San Francisco in the 60s. And the bright colors, the very graphic silhouettes, and the distorted type was a real hallmark of the psychedelic style. And of course the turn on and tune out drug taking, free love movement of the 60s was all part of this look, and it all came together. In the 60s and 70s, we started getting into something called figurative typography. And this is kind of fun to explore and play with now, even nowadays. Where you take a word and you set it, you treat it such that it indicates what the word is saying. And you can see that this word beards looks like a beard. And you will have an assignment in this course where you get to play around with figurative typography and have some fun with it. So it's kind of whimsical, fun way of treating type. Now this is an example of dot matrix type and the way that dot matrix printers would print type. This is where we're in the 70s now, and we're talking about more digital technology. It wasn't quite out there for everyone yet, but it was starting to be developed, and fonts for the screen were starting to be designed. And these are early examples of Macintosh fonts. They're named after cities, and I remember these from when I started my computer career with the early Macintosh computers, and these very bitmapped blocky letter forms were a hallmark of that early digital type style, and they've come a long way since then. Jumping over to the punk style, this was a real nod back to the Futurism and the Dada style, and this was a case where, the punk movement was a real backlash against everything that had gone before, and a real sort of anarchistic political movement, really based in music and in attitude, and the graphic design and the type treatments really took that and pushed it. It was no rules, throw everything out the window, we don't care. That's the whole idea about punk. Now in the 80s, things settled down a little bit. I just love the jackets these guys are wearing. What happened in the 80s was that graphic design was becoming more digital, computer graphics were becoming more popular, and so special effects like this chrome and this neon became all the rage in the 80s. And we see a lot of this sort of thing in design that was produced back then. Now, of course, it's very dated and out of style, but it's a real nod back to the 80s with these special effects. In the 90s, there were some very important design and typography steps made. A style called grunge or deconstruction became very popular. These are three examples of the Ray Gun magazine cover designed by a well-known designer named David Carson. And he took typography, and again, he threw rules out the window. He would slice up type, he would turn letters around, he would obliterate parts of words. He really was a great example of thinking outside the box and destroying the box. And the Ray Gun magazine is a really good example of that era of typography. It's 20 years plus old now, but there's still a lot of freshness in the way that the type was used in this particular style. And David Carson and the grunge deconstruction type movements are well worth your research. To finish up, we're going to go into the modern day, and this is what we are working with now. Now, this isn't the only thing we're working with, but this is an example of clean basics. Back to basics, very, very simple, clean, elegant typography. In addition to all of the free font websites out there that you can see and download free fonts that are whimsical and decorative, but we also go back to clean, basic, simple type. Helvetica, which isn't in this list, but remember that Helvetica is one of the most popular fonts in the world. It is clean and simple, and a real sense of sort of going back to basics here. So there is a really brief overview of the massive history of typography and some graphic design history. I'm hopeful that it will give you a basis to work with as you develop your own typographic and design styles. Who knows, maybe some of you will go forward and write a chapter in the continuing history of typography as we move forward. Good luck.